April 9th, 1241. The frozen plains of Silesia. Duke Henry II. The pious stood in his stirrups, surveying the nightmare unfolding before him. Across the snow-dusted fields near the town of Liegnitz, modern-day Legnica in Poland, an army unlike anything Europe had ever seen was deploying for battle. The Mongols had arrived. For 15 years, the Mongol Empire had been an abstract terror, a rumour whispered by Eastern traders, a biblical scourge mentioned in papal letters. Stories filtered west of entire kingdoms disappearing, of cities reduced to pyramids of skulls, of an unstoppable horde that moved faster than news of its approach. European nobility had dismissed these tales as Eastern exaggeration. Surely no army could be as devastating as the rumours suggested. Duke Henry was about to discover that the rumours hadn't been exaggerated. They had been understated. The Mongol force facing him, roughly 20,000 warriors under the command of Kadan, grandson of Genghis Khan, represented the most sophisticated military machine the medieval world had ever produced. They were the culmination of decades of conquest that had subjugated China, destroyed the Khwarezmian Empire, crushed the Kievan Rus, and now stood poised to pour into the heart of Christian Europe. Henry's army, perhaps 25,000 strong, was a coalition of Polish knights, German crusaders, Teutonic Knights, and Templar volunteers. It represented the flower of European martial tradition, heavily armoured cavalry whose tactical doctrine had remained essentially unchanged since Charlemagne. These were men bred for close combat, trained from childhood in the lance and sword, encased in the finest armour European metallurgy could produce. The Teutonic Knights alone were perhaps the most feared warriors in Christendom, monastic soldiers whose combination of religious fervour and military discipline had carved out a crusader state along the Baltic. Their white surcoats emblazoned with black crosses were symbols of unwavering martial prowess. Facing them were warriors who had perfected a completely different philosophy of war. The Mongol army was built around the horse archer, a soldier who could loose arrows with deadly accuracy while riding at full gallop. These weren't the heavy cavalry charges of European warfare. These were fluid, mobile forces that attacked and withdrew like ocean waves, never committing to the decisive engagement that European knights craved. What neither side fully understood as they faced each other across the Silesian plain was that this battle represented a collision between two military systems that had evolved in complete isolation. European warfare was about shock and mass, concentrating armoured force at a decisive point. Mongol warfare was about manoeuvre and exhaustion, destroying enemy cohesion before delivering the killing blow. Only one system would leave the field intact. The Mongol invasion of Europe in 1241 was not a raid or a punitive expedition. It was a calculated conquest, planned with the same meticulous detail that had brought down empires from the Pacific to the Caspian Sea. The campaign had begun in late 1240 when Batu Khan, leading the western wing of the Mongol Empire, crossed the Carpathian Mountains with perhaps 150,000 warriors divided into multiple columns. The Mongols never moved as a single mass. Their strategy relied on multiple independent forces advancing on parallel routes, coordinating through an unprecedented courier system that allowed armies separated by hundreds of miles to execute synchronized attacks. The northern column under Kadan and Baidar had devastated Poland, destroying Krakow and Sandomierz with methodical efficiency. Polish resistance had been crushed through a combination of speed and psychological warfare. The Mongols would bypass fortified positions, destroy everything around them, then return to starve out the defenders. Cities that resisted were annihilated with such thoroughness that survivors spread tales of demonic invaders who showed no mercy. Duke Henry had assembled his army at Liegnitz as the last substantial force capable of stopping the Mongol advance into the German heartlands. He had sent urgent appeals to King Wenceslaus of Bohemia, who was approaching with reinforcements. Henry's strategic calculation was sound. Wait for Wenceslaus, combine forces, and present the Mongols with an army too large to destroy. The Mongols, masters of intelligence gathering, knew exactly what Henry planned. They had no intention of allowing the European forces to unite. The battle would be fought on April 9th, not because Duke Henry chose that day, but because the Mongols forced his hand through a combination of manoeuvre and deception that showcased their sophisticated understanding of operational warfare. The Mongol army that deployed on the plain of Liegnitz was organised around the decimal system that Genghis Khan had perfected. Units of 10 warriors formed an arban, 10 arbans formed a dragoon of 100, 10 Jaguns formed a Mingun of 1,000, and 10 Minguns formed a Tumen of 10,000. This organisation allowed unprecedented flexibility. Orders could cascade through the command structure with speed and precision impossible in European armies, where command was based on feudal relationships and personal loyalty. Each Mongol warrior was a professional soldier in a way that European knights were not. The typical Mongol cavalryman had been raised in the saddle, learning archery before he could walk properly. By adulthood, he could shoot accurately at 300 yards while riding at full gallop, loosing arrows forward, to the sides, or backward in the Parthian shot that allowed retreating horsemen to continue engaging pursuers. The composite bow they carried was a masterpiece of engineering that took years to construct. Made from layers of wood, horn, sinew, and sometimes bone, the bow could store enormous energy in a relatively compact package. Draw weights ranged from 100 to 160 pounds, far exceeding European bows. The arrows carried in quivers holding 60 to 80 shafts came in different varieties. Light arrows with small heads for long-range volleys that would arc over enemy formations. Heavy arrows with broad heads for close-range penetration. Armor-piercing arrows with narrow points designed to punch through mail. Whistling arrows that created an eerie shriek in flight, used for signalling and psychological effect. Each warrior carried multiple bows as backups, and wore armour that was lighter but more flexible than European plate. Mongol lamella armour consisted of small plates of hardened leather or iron laced together, providing excellent protection against slashing attacks while allowing full mobility. The wealthier heavy cavalry wore additional protection, sometimes including captured European mail or scale armour over their lamella. But the Mongol advantage wasn't just equipment, it was doctrine, a systematised approach to warfare that had been refined through decades of conquest. The Mongols didn't fight for glory or honour, they fought to win with minimum casualties to themselves. This meant avoiding the frontal charges that European knights considered the height of martial virtue. Mongol tactics centred on the feigned retreat, a manoeuvre so difficult to execute that most armies couldn't attempt it. The basic pattern was elegantly simple. Light cavalry would engage the enemy, loose arrows to inflict casualties and provoke a charge, then retreat. Not a panicked rout, but a controlled withdrawal with rear ranks continuing to shoot. European knights trained to pursue broken enemies would chase. The Mongols would lead them on for miles, breaking up their formation, exhausting their horses, separating them from their infantry support. Then the trap would close. Heavy cavalry concealed on the flanks would charge into the disorganized knights. The light cavalry would wheel around and attack from behind. Surrounded, exhausted, separated from support, even heavily armoured knights could be overwhelmed. The Mongols had used variations of this tactic to destroy armies across Asia. They had crushed the Khwarezmian Empire, perhaps the most powerful Muslim state of the era, using these methods. They had annihilated multiple Russian principalities. They had devastated Hungary at the Battle of Mohi just 2 days before Liegnitz, using river crossings and night attacks that showcased their operational sophistication. Duke Henry knew none of this operational history. European intelligence on Mongol tactics was essentially non-existent. The few survivors of encounters with Mongol armies told contradictory stories. Some described cowardly horsemen who fled at the first charge. Others spoke of demons who attacked from all sides simultaneously. No one had developed a coherent picture of Mongol operational methods. What Henry did understand was that he commanded the finest heavy cavalry in Christendom. His Teutonic Knights alone were worth their weight in legend. Founded in 1190 during the Third Crusade, the Teutonic Order had evolved into a military machine that combined monastic discipline with aristocratic martial training. Teutonic Knights were not mere soldiers. They were warrior monks who took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They lived in commanderies organised along military lines, training constantly in horsemanship, weapons, and tactics. A fully equipped Teutonic Knight represented an enormous investment. The armour alone, full mail hauberk with additional plate protection on vulnerable areas, could cost the equivalent of a small estate. The warhorse, specifically bred and trained for combat, was worth several years of a peasant's income. The weapons, lance, sword, mace and dagger were crafted by master smiths. Most importantly, the knight himself represented decades of training. From childhood, aristocratic boys destined for knighthood learned horsemanship and combat. The training was brutal and comprehensive. By the time a man became a knight, He could control a warhorse with legs alone while wielding weapons in both hands. He could fight effectively on foot or horseback. He could operate in the chaos of melee combat where visibility was limited to a few feet and the noise was deafening. The Teutonic Knights had proven themselves against pagan Baltic tribes, developing tactics for fighting in forests and swamps where traditional cavalry charges were impossible. They had experience adapting to different enemies and terrain. This adaptability would be crucial in the coming battle. Supporting the Teutonic Knights were Polish nobility, themselves skilled cavalrymen, and various contingents of German knights. The coalition also included infantry, though European tactical doctrine relegated foot soldiers to secondary roles. Infantry could hold defensive positions and mop up broken enemies, but battles were decided by cavalry charges. Henry's battle plan was conventional European warfare. Deploy in lines with cavalry concentrated for maximum shock effect. When the enemy approached, charge home with lance and sword. Break their formation through superior armour and fighting skill. Pursue and destroy the fleeing survivors. This doctrine had worked against every enemy Europe had faced for generations. Against the Mongols, it would prove catastrophic. The battle began at dawn with Mongol scouts probing the European positions. These weren't skirmishers in the European sense, like cavalry sent forward to harass. These were reconnaissance elements gathering precise intelligence on European dispositions, strength, and likely tactics. European observers noted the Mongol horsemen with professional interest. The enemy cavalry appeared lightly equipped by European standards: small ponies, no visible armour, bows rather than lances. Some of Henry's knights laughed. These were the terrible Mongols. They looked like peasant hunters, not warriors. This contempt would be their undoing. The Mongol, shaggy steppe ponies were purpose-bred for endurance and hardiness. While they lacked the size and speed of European warhorses in short sprints, they could travel 80 miles per day for weeks on end, living off sparse grazing that would starve European horses. Each Mongol warrior travelled with multiple horses, switching mounts to keep them fresh. This mobility was strategic. The Mongols could concentrate forces faster than any European army, attack, withdraw, and return before the enemy could respond. As the morning progressed, the main Mongol force deployed. European observers tried to make sense of the enemy formation. The Mongols arranged themselves in what appeared to be loose groups rather than the tight formations European doctrine demanded. Gaps existed between units that seemed large enough to ride through. It looked like poor discipline or inexperience. It was neither. The Mongol formation was designed for flexibility. The gaps allowed units to move without interfering with each other, to advance or retreat independently, to envelope enemy formations without their own forces colliding. What looked like disorder was actually sophisticated organisation beyond European tactical comprehension. Kadan, commanding the Mongol force, surveyed the European army with professional calculation. He had fought from China to Eastern Europe, facing every type of warrior the world could produce. Heavy cavalry was not new to him. The Mongols had destroyed the Khwarezmian heavy cavalry, among the finest in the Muslim world. They had crushed Russian boyar cavalry at the Kalka River. They had annihilated Hungarian knights at Mohi 2 days earlier. The Europeans had better armour and larger horses, but the tactical pattern would be the same. Provoke a charge, fragment their formation, destroy them in detail. Kadan gave the order. The Mongol light cavalry, perhaps 3,000 horsemen, advanced toward the European lines. At 300 yards they began shooting. The sound was distinctive, a drumming throb as thousands of bowstrings released simultaneously. The air filled with arrows, a cloud of projectiles arcing toward the massed European cavalry. The first volleys caused minimal damage. Mongol arrows, loosed at maximum range, struggled to penetrate the heavy European armour. Knights felt arrows strike their mail or plate and skitter away ineffectively. Some horses were hit, protected by less complete armour, but casualties were light. To the European knights, this confirmed their assessment. The Mongol bows were inadequate against proper armour. Victory would come through the charge, as it always did. Duke Henry gave the order, trumpets sounded across the European line. The heavy cavalry, perhaps 8,000 strong with the Teutonic Knights forming the elite corps, began to advance. The sound of that many armoured horsemen moving together was like rolling thunder. The ground shook. Lances came down, forming a forest of steel points. The riders leaned forward in their saddles, preparing for impact. This was what they had trained for their entire lives, the moment when superior breeding, equipment and courage would decide the battle through shock and violence. The Mongol light cavalry ceased shooting and withdrew. They didn't break or scatter. They retreated in organized groups, maintaining formation, continuing to shoot backward as they rode. The European charge accelerated. This was the moment of triumph, the enemy breaking before their might. Knights who had doubted now felt vindication. The Mongols were cowards who couldn't face real warriors. The pursuit continued. 500 yards, 1,000 yards. The Mongol cavalry stayed just out of reach, tantalizing, drawing the Europeans forward. Some of the pursuing knights began to notice problems. Their formation was stretching out. The fastest horses pulled ahead while others lagged behind. The tight concentration of force that made cavalry charges effective was disintegrating. Gaps appeared between groups of knights. The Teutonic Knights, better disciplined, maintained better cohesion, but even they were becoming strung out. The Mongols led them on for nearly 2 miles, all the while loosing arrows. The effect was cumulative. Individual arrows might not penetrate armour, but hundreds of hits took a toll. Horses stumbled with arrows in their legs. Knights found arrows wedged in armour gaps, in arms and legs where protection was lighter. The wounded began to fall behind. Then the Mongols sprang the trap. From concealed positions on both flanks, Mongol heavy cavalry emerged. These were the elite guards, the seshig, wearing the best armour the Empire could provide. They carried lances and sabres for close combat, reinforced by lighter cavalry with bows. The heavy cavalry hit the strung-out European knights from both sides simultaneously. At the same time, the retreating light cavalry wheeled around and charged back into the European front. In seconds, the pursuing European knights found themselves surrounded, attacked from 3 directions at once. The nature of the combat changed instantly. The European knights had expected a frontal collision where armour and strength would prevail. Instead, they faced swirling attacks from all angles. The Mongols didn't try to break through the European armour in direct combat. They attacked horses, crippling the mounts and leaving knights stranded. They targeted gaps in armour, stabbing with lances into armpits and visors. Most devastatingly, they shot arrows into the mass of confused Europeans at point-blank range. At close range, Mongol bows punched through all but the heaviest armour. Knights who had felt invulnerable at 300 yards found arrows driven completely through mail at 30 yards. The sheer volume of projectiles was overwhelming. Dozens of arrows converged on individual targets. Even the finest armour had gaps. Visors could be penetrated. Arms and legs were vulnerable. Horses, less protected than riders, went down in droves. Individual. European knights fought with desperate courage. The Teutonic Knights especially, trained for exactly this kind of chaotic melee, took a heavy toll on their attackers. In close combat, a fully armoured knight was formidable. Mongol lamellar armour could be penetrated by European swords and maces. Individual duels favoured the heavier European warriors. But this wasn't a series of individual duels. It was organised chaos where the Mongols controlled the tempo. When Europeans concentrated to fight, the Mongols withdrew. When Europeans tried to reform, the Mongols charged back in. The Europeans couldn't force the decisive engagement where their advantages would matter. Meanwhile, the Mongol light cavalry, freed from pursuit, began systematically destroying the European infantry. The foot soldiers, watching their cavalry disappear in pursuit, suddenly found themselves under attack. Mongol horse archers circled the infantry formations at a distance, loosing arrow after arrow into the packed ranks. European infantry, equipped with spears and shields, had no effective response. They couldn't catch the mounted archers. Their own archers, vastly outnumbered and outranged by Mongol composite bows, were suppressed. All they could do was stand behind shields and endure. The psychological effect was devastating. Watching arrows pour into your formation, seeing men fall around you, unable to strike back, corroded morale faster than casualties. Some infantry formations broke and ran, only to be ridden down by Mongol cavalry. Those who held position were simply shot to pieces over the next hours. Duke Henry, probably watching from the centre of his formation with his command group, realised the battle was lost. The flower of his cavalry was being destroyed in detail. His infantry was disintegrating. The Mongols controlled the battlefield completely, attacking and withdrawing at will. He needed to extract what forces remained and retreat to Liegnitz, or another fortified position. But retreat was impossible. The Mongols had anticipated this and positioned forces to block withdrawal routes. European survivors trying to fall back found more Mongol cavalry between them and safety. The trap was complete. What followed was not a battle, but a slaughter. For hours, Mongol cavalry hunted down European soldiers across the Silesian plain. Knights who tried to surrender were killed. Infantry who threw down weapons were ridden down. The Mongols had learned from decades of conquest that showing mercy encouraged future resistance. Terror was a weapon, and wholesale massacre was its ultimate expression. Duke Henry attempted to escape with a small bodyguard. Mongol cavalry caught them near the town of Liegnitz. What happened next became legend, though exact details are disputed. According to some accounts, Henry fought to the end, killing several Mongols before being overwhelmed. According to others, he was captured alive and executed. What is certain is that Henry was killed and his body mutilated. The Mongols, as was their custom after major victories, collected trophies. They cut off the heads of noble prisoners and constructed a pyramid of skulls visible for miles. Henry's head, identified by his wife later through distinctive dental features, was placed at the summit. The Mongol custom of cutting off ears from corpses to count casualties yielded 9 sacks of ears from the battlefield. If each sack held 1,000 ears, the European casualties approached 9,000 dead, though this figure may be exaggerated. What's certain is that the European coalition army was effectively annihilated. The Teutonic Knights, that elite of Christian warriors, were nearly wiped out. Of the hundreds who charged into the Mongol trap, fewer than 50 survived. Entire Polish noble families were extinguished. German contingents disappeared almost completely. It was one of the most complete tactical victories in medieval warfare. The Mongol casualties were likely in the hundreds rather than thousands. This extraordinary kill ratio, possibly 20 to 1 or higher, reflected the fundamental mismatch between the two systems of warfare. The Europeans had fought bravely and with skill, but bravery was no substitute for appropriate tactics. They had charged into a trap designed by military geniuses and executed by professionals who had spent their entire lives perfecting mounted warfare. The aftermath of Liegnitz sent shockwaves through Europe. News of the disaster spread faster than the Mongol advance itself. Panicked messengers carried tales of Christian armies destroyed, of invincible horsemen who attacked from all directions simultaneously, of weapons that couldn't touch them, and arrows that struck down the mightiest knights. The psychological impact exceeded even the military disaster. Medieval Europe had faced defeats before, but always from comprehensible enemies. Muslim armies fought in ways Europeans understood. Viking raiders could be defeated. Pagan tribes could be converted or conquered. The Mongols were different. They operated according to principles completely foreign to European military thought. How did you fight an enemy who refused decisive engagement, who treated retreat as a weapon, who coordinated attacks across hundreds of miles? Europe's response was panic bordering on hysteria. Pope Gregory IX declared the Mongol invasion a divine punishment for Christian sins. He called for a crusade, but few responded. Who wanted to face warriors who had just annihilated the finest cavalry in Christendom? Cities prepared for siege. Venice and Genoa, with their access to intelligence from Eastern traders, began fortifying their walls and contracting for mercenaries. The German states, fragmented and feuding, attempted to organize collective defense while simultaneously maneuvering against each other. In Vienna, Emperor Frederick II issued a proclamation calling all Christians to arms against the Mongol threat. The proclamation went largely ignored, partially because Frederick was simultaneously feuding with the Pope and several German princes. Europe's political fragmentation, normally an advantage in preventing the rise of tyrannies, became a crippling weakness against an invasion. But the invasion stopped. Not because of European resistance, but because of events 5,000 miles away. In December 1241, 8 months after Liegnitz, the great Khan Ögedei died in Mongolia. According to Mongol custom, all princes of the blood had to return to Karakorum for the Kurultai, the great assembly that would choose the next Khan. Batu Khan, commanding the European invasion, withdrew his armies back across the Carpathians. The campaign that had terrified Europe simply ended. European historians would debate for centuries why the Mongols withdrew. Some claimed Christian prayers had been answered, others credited the resistance at Liegnitz and other battles with exhausting the Mongols. Modern historians understand that the withdrawal had nothing to do with Europe and everything to do with Mongol internal politics. Europe had been saved by the death of a man thousands of miles away. The Mongols never returned in force. Subsequent Khans focused on conquering China and fighting among themselves. The Western Khanates that emerged from these civil wars, the Golden Horde and the Ilkhanate, raided Eastern Europe periodically, but never attempted the systematic conquest that had seemed inevitable in 1241. Europe had narrowly avoided subjugation. The Battle of Liegnitz showcased the collision of two radically different military systems. The European system was built around heavy cavalry, shock tactics, and individual martial prowess. It was expensive, requiring years of training and enormous economic investment, but it produced warriors of exceptional quality. The Mongol system was built around mobility, archery, and coordinated maneuver. It was equally expensive in different ways, requiring a culture where every man was a warrior, and horses were more important than agriculture, but it produced armies of unprecedented flexibility. The technological advantages were more evenly matched than is often assumed. European armour was superior in quality if not design. European swords were better metallurgically than most Mongol weapons. European warhorses were stronger and faster in short sprints. But the Mongols had better bows, better arrows, better horsemanship, and vastly superior operational doctrine. The composite bow, in particular, was a technological marvel that Europe had never developed. The reflex bow, where the unstrung bow curved away from the archer, stored energy in ways European longbows couldn't match. Construction took years, with layers of materials glued together and allowed to cure under tension. The result was a weapon that could shoot farther and hit harder than any European bow while being usable from horseback. The Mongol arrow, shorter than European types but with a heavier head, was optimized for penetration rather than range. At close quarters, these arrows could punch through mail with shocking effectiveness. European survivors of Liegnitz reported arrows driven completely through shields and the arms holding them, but technology was secondary to doctrine. The Mongols had developed a way of war based on maneuver, deception, and patience. They understood operational art, the coordination of multiple engagements to achieve strategic goals. They gathered intelligence systematically, using merchants and travellers as spies. They planned campaigns months in advance, with multiple columns moving in coordination. European warfare was comparatively unsophisticated. Battles were fought for honour and glory as much as strategic necessity. Intelligence gathering was haphazard. Coordination between allied forces was minimal, often breaking down over questions of precedence and command authority. The very feudal system that made heavy cavalry possible, with lords owing military service to superiors, created armies that were temporary coalitions rather than unified forces. The lessons of Liegnitz were slowly learned. European armies began adopting lighter cavalry for reconnaissance and skirmishing. Infantry, particularly crossbowmen, received increased emphasis. Fortification design evolved to include multiple layers of defence against mobile armies, but the fundamental European tactical approach remained unchanged. Heavy cavalry remained the decisive arm until gunpowder weapons made armour obsolete centuries later. The Teutonic Knights, nearly destroyed at Liegnitz, rebuilt their order and continued their Baltic crusades. They adapted some Mongol tactics, particularly the use of light cavalry for reconnaissance and the feigned retreat to draw enemies into ambushes. But they remained heavy cavalry at heart, their identity bound up with the armoured charge. The Mongol Empire, having reached its maximum extent, began its long decline. The system that Genghis Khan had created, where merit mattered more than birth and conquered peoples could rise to positions of authority, gradually gave way to traditional patterns of hereditary aristocracy and ethnic division. The military effectiveness that had conquered half the world degraded as Mongol warriors settled into the traditional role of ruling elite. By 1300, the unified Mongol Empire had fragmented into competing khanatins. By 1400, even these fragments were under pressure from resurgent Chinese, Persian and Russian powers. By 1500, the Mongol military system that had terrorized Eurasia was a historical memory. But the Battle of Liegnitz remained in European memory as a cautionary tale. For centuries, it was cited as an example of the dangers of overconfidence and the importance of understanding your enemy. Military theorists from Machiavelli to Clausewitz studied the battle as an example of superior tactics overcoming superior equipment. In modern military analysis, Liegnitz is studied as a textbook example of several principles: the importance of intelligence and understanding enemy capabilities, the danger of pursuing a broken enemy without proper reconnaissance, the effectiveness of combined arms, with the Mongols seamlessly integrating light cavalry, heavy cavalry, and horse archers. The psychological dimension of warfare, with the Mongols using terror as deliberate policy. Most fundamentally, Liegnitz demonstrated that there is no single correct way to wage war. The European system of warfare was highly effective against enemies who fought according to similar rules. Against the Mongols, it was worse than useless, actively counterproductive, since the training and doctrine that made knights effective in European warfare made them vulnerable to Mongol tactics. For the Teutonic Knights specifically, Liegnitz was a defining trauma. The order that had seemed invincible against Baltic pagans had been casually destroyed by an enemy they hadn't understood. The survivors carried that knowledge forward. In subsequent decades, the Teutonic Knights became more cautious, more willing to use intelligence and maneuver, rather than relying purely on the shock of heavy cavalry. The battle also marked the high water mark of Mongol expansion into Europe. After Liegnitz and Mohi, after the systematic devastation of Poland and Hungary, the Mongols were positioned to overrun Germany, Italy, and France. The armies that might have stopped them had been destroyed. The political fragmentation of Europe offered no coordinated resistance, yet the invasion stopped, and Europe was spared the fate that had befallen China, Persia, and Russia. How different would world history have been if Ögedei had lived another decade? Would the Mongols have conquered Europe as thoroughly as they conquered Asia? Would European civilization have been absorbed into a Mongol world empire? These questions are unanswerable, but Liegnitz suggests the conquest was entirely possible. The European military system had no adequate response to Mongol operational art. In 1945, at a military history conference in Moscow, a Soviet general gave a lecture on medieval warfare. He contrasted Liegnitz with Grunwald, the battle in 1410 where a Polish-Lithuanian army destroyed the Teutonic Knights. At Grunwald, the Poles had used light cavalry in the Mongol style, refusing frontal engagement and using archery to disrupt the Teutonic charges. The general's conclusion was prescient. The Europeans who defeated the Mongols were those who learned from them. The Europeans who clung to their traditional methods were destroyed. At Liegnitz, Duke Henry and the Teutonic Knights fought bravely and died pointlessly because they fought the wrong battle. They fought the battle they had trained for, wanted, and understood. The Mongols fought the battle they could win. In warfare, that distinction is everything. The frozen plain of Liegnitz, where 9,000 European warriors died in a single afternoon, stands as testimony to a simple truth. Courage is not enough. Skill is not enough. Even superior equipment is not enough. Victory requires understanding, adaptation, and the humility to recognize when your enemy knows something you don't. Duke Henry the Pious died without understanding how he had been beaten. His knights charged bravely into a trap they couldn't comprehend, fighting to the end according to the codes of honor that had been instilled since childhood. They died as warriors, but they died as obsolete warriors, destroyed by a military system they had neither the knowledge nor the doctrine to counter. The Mongol horse archers rode away from Liegnitz toward more conquests, leaving behind a field of corpses and a lesson Europe would take centuries to fully absorb. The age of the armoured knight would continue for another 200 years, but its vulnerability had been exposed. The thunder of hooves and the whistle of arrows that April Day had announced a truth that European nobility would spend generations denying. The future of warfare belonged not to the heaviest armour or the bravest charge, but to mobility, firepower, and the operational art that could coordinate them. The Mongols understood this in 1241. Europe would learn it eventually, written in blood on frozen fields from Silesia to Mohi, carved into the collective memory by warriors who fought like nothing Europe had ever seen. The Teutonic Knights recovered, rebuilt, and fought on. But they never forgot Liegnitz. None of the survivors could. The day the Mongol horse archers met the flower of European chivalry had ended with the impossible. The invincible had been destroyed, not through weakness or cowardice, but through facing warriors who played by different rules and played them better. 800 years later, military academies still study that battle. The tactics have changed. The weapons are unrecognizable, but the lesson remains. Know your enemy, understand their methods, adapt or die. Duke Henry learned that lesson too late. His head, mounted on a Mongol victory pyramid, stood as a monument to the price of ignorance in warfare. The Mongol withdrawal in late 1241 left Europe in a state of profound shock, mixed with confusion. Cities that had prepared for siege found themselves suddenly safe. not through their own efforts but through the accident of a death halfway across the world. The reprieve felt temporary, conditional, as though the sword of Damocles had merely paused in its descent rather than being withdrawn entirely. In the immediate aftermath of Liegnitz, the survivors struggled to comprehend what had happened. The few Teutonic Knights who escaped the massacre returned to their commanderies bearing tales that seemed impossible. They described enemies who fought without honour, who refused to stand and fight like proper warriors, who used trickery and deception as weapons. These accounts were met with scepticism and outright disbelief by knights who hadn't faced the Mongols. Surely the survivors were exaggerating to excuse their defeat. Surely no army could be as effective as described, but the physical evidence was undeniable. Entire noble lineages had been extinguished at Liegnitz. The Teutonic Order had lost perhaps 60% of its brothers in a single afternoon. Polish military power had been effectively destroyed. Duke Henry's mutilated body had been recovered and buried, but the psychological wound remained open. The detailed after-action reports compiled by surviving commanders make for chilling reading. They describe Mongol formations that moved with impossible coordination, cavalry units that could attack and withdraw without becoming disordered, archers who could shoot accurately while riding at full gallop in any direction. To knights trained in the relatively static warfare of European feudal conflicts, these capabilities seemed almost supernatural. One Teutonic knight, Brother Heinrich von Hohenlohe, who survived Liegnitz by being unhorsed early in the battle and left for dead, wrote an extensive account in 1242 that circulated among military orders. His description of Mongol tactics was remarkably accurate, and ahead of its time in recognizing their sophistication. He wrote that the Mongols fought as a single organism, each part responding to signals invisible to European observers. He noted their use of different coloured flags and banners for communication, their employment of drummers and horn players to coordinate movements across vast distances, their systematic approach to battlefield geometry. Von Hohenlohe recognised something crucial that most of his contemporaries missed. The Mongol victory wasn't luck or demonic assistance, it was the product of superior organisation and training applied systematically. He advocated for European armies to study Mongol methods, to adopt their reconnaissance techniques, to learn their use of feigned retreats and envelopments. His recommendations were largely ignored. The European military establishment wasn't ready to learn from barbarians. The cultural barrier to understanding was immense. European warfare was bound up with concepts of honour, individual glory, and the social hierarchy. Knights fought to prove their valour, to win renown, to fulfil their obligations as the warrior aristocracy. The idea of refusing combat when challenged, of retreating as a deliberate tactic, of victory through trickery rather than honourable battle, was almost incomprehensible. The Mongols had no such constraints. They fought to win, period. Honour was found in victory, not in method. A Mongol commander who destroyed an enemy through deception was praised, not criticised. The goal was conquest with minimum casualties to your own forces, not proving individual courage through single combat. This fundamental difference in military culture meant that even when European commanders recognised Mongol tactical superiority, they struggled to implement similar methods. Knights who had spent their entire lives training for the frontal charge couldn't simply retrain as horse archers. The social structure that produced heavy cavalry couldn't easily be modified to produce light cavalry without undermining the feudal system itself. However, some lessons did penetrate. In Hungary, which had been devastated even more thoroughly than Poland during the 1241 invasion, King Bela IV implemented military reforms directly inspired by Mongol methods. He recruited Cuman horse archers, steppe nomads who fought in the Mongol style, and integrated them into Hungarian armies. He built a network of stone fortifications that could withstand Mongol siege tactics. He reorganized his military to emphasize mobility and reconnaissance. When the Mongols returned to raid Hungary in the 1280s, they found a much more effective resistance. The Hungarian army no longer relied purely on heavy cavalry charges. They used light cavalry to screen movements, to gather intelligence, to harass Mongol formations. They refused to be drawn into the pursuit traps that had destroyed them at Mohi. The Mongols, facing an enemy that had learned from previous encounters, withdrew after limited success. This adaptation showed that European forces could counter Mongol tactics, but only by fundamentally changing their approach to warfare. The Teutonic Knights, reconstituting themselves after the disaster at Liegnitz, took a different lesson. Rather than adopting Mongol methods, They doubled down on what they did best while becoming much more cautious about when and where to fight. The order rebuilt its strength through aggressive recruitment in Germany and across Europe. The near destruction at Liegnitz actually enhanced their prestige in a perverse way. They had faced the terror of the East and survived, even if barely. Young nobles seeking to prove themselves against the most fearsome enemies flocked to join. By 1250, the Teutonic Order had rebuilt to pre-Liegnitz strength, but the order that emerged was different from what had existed before. The unquestioning confidence in heavy cavalry supremacy had been shattered. Teutonic commanders became much more careful about intelligence gathering before committing to battle. They employed local scouts extensively, particularly in the Baltic, where they continued their crusading mission against pagan Prussians and Lithuanians. They fortified extensively, building massive stone castles that served as bases for mobile operations. The castle system they developed, with massive fortresses like Marienburg that could serve as regional administrative centres and military strongpoints, reflected lessons from the Mongol invasion. You couldn't defeat enemies like the Mongols in open battle unless conditions were perfect, but you could deny them easy conquest through defence in depth. The Teutonic approach to warfare in the decades after Liegnitz showed sophisticated adaptation. In the Baltic, they combined heavy cavalry for decisive engagements with lighter cavalry for reconnaissance and pursuit. They used river transport extensively to move forces faster than enemy armies could react. They employed psychological warfare, using the fearsome reputation of their white-mantled knights to intimidate opponents into surrender. Against the pagan Lithuanians, who themselves employed tactics similar to the Mongols with horse archers and feigned retreats, the Teutonic Knights developed counter-tactics that showed they had learned from Liegnitz. They used crossbowmen to suppress Lithuanian archers. They advanced in echelons that couldn't be easily surrounded. They refused pursuit into forests and swamps, where Lithuanian light cavalry had the advantage. Most importantly, they fought when conditions favoured them and declined battle when they didn't. This was a revolutionary concept for European knights, whose culture emphasised accepting any challenge. The Lithuanians, observing these adaptations, complained that the Teutonic Knights fought without honour, refusing fair battle and retreating when challenged. The Teutonic response was essentially that honour was less important than victory. This pragmatic approach represented a fundamental shift in European military thinking, directly traceable to the trauma of Liegnitz. The broader impact of the Mongol invasions on European military development is difficult to quantify, but certainly significant. The introduction of gunpowder weapons to Europe, probably through Mongol intermediaries who had learned of them from China, would eventually render heavy cavalry obsolete. But even before gunpowder, the Mongol demonstration of light cavalry effectiveness influenced European tactics. The Hungarian light cavalry that played a crucial role in later European conflicts was a direct response to Mongol invasions. Polish and Lithuanian forces developed similar capabilities. Even in Western Europe, which never faced Mongol invasion directly, the stories from the East influenced military thinking. The gradual European shift toward combined arms tactics, integrating cavalry, infantry, and missile troops rather than relying purely on heavy cavalry, owed something to the Mongol example. The Battle of Crécy in 1346, where English longbowmen destroyed French heavy cavalry, showed that missile troops could dominate armoured knights. This lesson had been demonstrated a century earlier at Liegnitz, but it took time for European military culture to absorb it. The intelligence systems that European states developed in the late medieval period also showed Mongol influence. The systematic use of merchants and travellers as intelligence sources, the emphasis on knowing enemy capabilities and intentions before committing to battle, the coordination of military operations over long distances, all reflected lessons learned from facing Mongol operational art. In the decades after 1241, European diplomatic missions were sent to the Mongol Empire seeking both to understand the enemy and to explore possibilities for alliance against mutual foes. These missions, including those of John of Plano Carpini and William of Rubruck, brought back detailed reports on Mongol society, military organisation, and tactical methods. These reports circulated among European military commanders and influenced tactical thinking. What emerges from these accounts is European recognition that the Mongols had developed military capabilities that exceeded European norms in specific areas. Their mobility, their coordination, their use of intelligence, their logistical systems that allowed armies to operate far from their bases for extended periods, all represented capabilities European forces struggled to match. But the reports also noted Mongol weaknesses. They struggled with fortified positions, lacking the siege equipment and expertise that European armies had developed. Their campaigns required vast numbers of horses, making them dependent on grasslands for grazing. Their cultural preference for mobility made them less effective in terrain like forests and mountains where movement was restricted. These observations suggested that while Mongols were nearly unbeatable in open terrain where their mobility could be exploited, they could be contained through a combination of fortification and terrain selection. This defensive strategy became European orthodoxy for dealing with steppe nomads: build strong fortifications, refuse open battle, use terrain to negate enemy mobility advantages. It was less a solution than a method of survival, trading space and economic damage for avoiding decisive defeat. The psychological impact of Liegnitz on the Teutonic Knights specifically was profound and lasting. The order had been founded on the premise that Christian warriors, fighting with God's blessing, were superior to any pagan enemy. The wholesale destruction at Liegnitz challenged this assumption fundamentally. How could God allow his warriors to be so thoroughly defeated by pagans? The theological crisis this created within the order was resolved through several arguments. First, the Mongols were interpreted as a divine punishment for Christian sins, similar to biblical punishments of Israel. Second, the eventual Mongol withdrawal was cast as divine intervention, proof that God protected Christendom even if individual battles were lost. Third, the suffering of the Teutonic Knights was reframed as martyrdom, proof of their devotion rather than evidence of defeat. These theological justifications allowed the order to maintain its identity and purpose despite the traumatic defeat. But at an operational level, the order never forgot the lesson. Never again would they charge blindly into battle against an unknown enemy. Never again would they assume that courage and armour were sufficient for victory. The battles that followed in the Teutonic Order's history showed this learning curve. At the Battle of Derb in 1260, Teutonic forces were ambushed and destroyed by Lithuanian forces using tactics similar to those the Mongols had employed at Liegnitz. The defeat showed that the lessons hadn't been fully absorbed and that Lithuanian light cavalry could be as dangerous as Mongol horse archers when conditions favoured them. But by the Battle of Grunwald in 1410, where the Teutonic Order faced a combined Polish-Lithuanian army, both sides had evolved considerably. The Lithuanians used feigned retreats and horse archer tactics. The Teutonic Knights used combined arms with heavy cavalry, crossbowmen, and even early gunpowder weapons. The battle was a Teutonic defeat, but not a massacre like Liegnitz. The order fought effectively in a complex tactical environment, withdrawing in reasonable order when the battle turned against them. The evolution from Liegnitz to Grunwald represented 270 years of military development directly influenced by the Mongol invasions. European heavy cavalry never regained the supreme dominance it had enjoyed before 1241. The combination of effective missile troops and mobile light cavalry could defeat even the best heavy cavalry if employed correctly. This reality gradually transformed European warfare toward the combined arms model that would dominate military thinking into the modern era. The Mongol invasions also accelerated European political centralization. The fragmentation that had left Europe vulnerable to the Mongol onslaught in 1241 was recognized as a dangerous weakness. In the decades that followed, European states gradually developed more centralized military systems that could respond more effectively to external threats. Standing armies, professional officer corps, centralized logistics, all the mechanisms of modern military power developed partially in response to the recognition that feudal military systems were inadequate against sophisticated enemies. The long-term strategic legacy of Liegnitz was thus paradoxical. The battle was a devastating defeat that nearly led to European conquest. But by demonstrating the inadequacy of existing military systems so dramatically, it forced adaptations that ultimately strengthened European military capabilities. The European armies that emerged from the late medieval period were far more sophisticated than those that had faced the Mongols in 1241, and the gap between European and steppe nomad military capabilities gradually reversed. By the 16th century, when European powers began expanding globally, they employed military systems that combined heavy cavalry, pike infantry, gunpowder weapons, and sophisticated logistics in ways that could dominate any opponent. This military superiority owed something to the painful lessons learned at Liegnitz and Mohi, where European confidence in their military supremacy had been shattered by enemies fighting in ways they hadn't anticipated. For the Mongols, Liegnitz represented the high watermark of a Western expansion, and perhaps a missed opportunity. Had Ogedei lived longer, had the Mongol armies returned to finish the conquest of Europe, world history would have taken a radically different path. A Europe conquered and absorbed into the Mongol Empire in the 13th century would not have produced the Renaissance, the Age of Exploration, or the scientific revolution as we know them. But the Mongols never returned in force. The Golden Horde that ruled Russia raided Poland and Hungary periodically, but never attempted systematic conquest of Central Europe. The reasons were partly internal politics and succession disputes that consumed Mongol attention, but also calculations about cost and benefit. Europe, with its fortifications, difficult terrain, and lack of the extensive grasslands Mongol armies required, was less attractive than richer targets elsewhere. The legacy of Liegnitz thus became a historical what-if rather than a turning point. Europe escaped conquest through luck rather than strength, but the scare was severe enough to force adaptation. The military systems that developed in the aftermath would eventually give Europe the tools to dominate much of the world. In this sense, the Mongol invasions inadvertently strengthened their future enemies by demonstrating what effective military organization looked like. The irony is that the Mongol military system that had seemed so overwhelming at 1241 was actually reaching its limits. The tactics that worked so well in open terrain were less effective against fortifications. The logistical system based on vast horse herds was constrained by geography. The political organization that allowed rapid decision-making under strong khans became a source of instability during succession crises. European military systems, while inferior in 1241, had greater long-term adaptability. The combination of different military traditions, from English longbows to Swiss pike formations to Italian condottieri, created a diverse military ecosystem where innovation could flourish. The political fragmentation that had been a weakness against unified Mongol command became a strength over time, as different states experimented with different military solutions. Today, historians studying Liegnitz see it as one of those pivotal battles where the losing side actually benefited in the long run. Like the Persian defeat of Greek city-states in some early battles of the Greco-Persian Wars, which prompted reforms that led to victories at Marathon and Salamis, the European defeat at Liegnitz prompted adaptations that prepared them for future conflicts. The battlefield itself at Liegnitz, in modern-day Legnica, Poland, bears little evidence of the slaughter that occurred there. Its agricultural land, peaceful and prosperous, with only a modest monument marking where Duke Henry fell. But the historical resonance remains. Military history courses at war colleges still examine Liegnitz as a case study in cultural military assumptions leading to defeat, in the importance of intelligence and reconnaissance, in the danger of pursuing a retreating enemy without adequate preparation. The Teutonic Knights, who suffered so catastrophically at Liegnitz, eventually dissolved as a military order, their last fortresses taken by Polish and Lithuanian forces, their remaining members secularized or absorbed into other organizations. But their legacy in military architecture, in the development of combined arms tactics, in the professionalization of medieval warfare, outlived the order itself. The lessons learned in blood on the Silesian plain in April 1241 echoed through centuries of European military development. When modern military historians trace the evolution of European warfare from medieval feudal hosts to professional national armies, Liegnitz appears as one of the critical points where the inadequacy of the old system became undeniable. The Mongol horse archers had met the Teutonic Knights, and in a single afternoon had demonstrated that even the finest warriors could be defeated by superior organization and tactics. That lesson, purchased at the cost of thousands of lives, would reshape how Europe thought about war for generations to come. The thunder of hooves and the whistle of arrows that day had announced not just a Mongol victory, but the beginning of a new era in military science, where understanding your enemy mattered as much as courage, where adaptation trumped tradition, and where the army that learned fastest survived longest.